First of all, Tridib, I want to thank you and Michelle for enabling one of the programs of the Urban Growth Seminar to be on this concept of large-scale regions, mega-regions, and also on how high-speed rail will, for all practical purposes, be the first building block institutionally and infrastructure within these large regions. Before I go into a few brief comments on mega regions, I just want to also thank Dan Masmanian, the director of the Banerjee Center, for enabling the concept of large regions and the governance issues of large regions to be one of the keystone projects in the Banerjee Center. I also want to note that we're joined today by one of my colleagues at SCAG for decades, Frank Hotchkiss. And the reason I identify Frank is, first of all, he's from Orange County and has been an adjuncted. That's right. He finally got religion and got out of that. But Frank was a adjunct at UCI Irvine, and in the early work at the Southern California Association of Governments, we really did develop this notion of a high-speed rail system being the foundation of mega regions. And Frank wrote a paper that I think is about 40 years old now. That in fact outlined this vision. So you have one of the early visionaries of that subject amongst us today, and I hope you have some great questions, Frank. The concept of mega regions, let me just briefly touch on how the concept really did evolve. And there were really three individuals that helped really get this idea conceptualized, identified, and mobilized. And they're Bob Yarrow, Petra's colleague at the Regional Plan Association, Armando Carbonell, who's at the Lincoln Land Institute, or the Lincoln Institute for Land Development. I have to get that right, or Armando would reach from Boston all the way over here and correct me. And I happen to be amongst that group. A studio from the University of Pennsylvania was brought to London, where Sir Peter Hall, who's probably one of the great thinkers in the field of planning and economic development, convened this salon, and they had all of the great minds of the EU together with a class at Pennsylvania and a number of practitioners in the United States to say, where is growth in America going over the next half-decade, decade? And out of that came the conceptualization of mega regions. And for all practical purposes, I would say that the instrument that created this concept started in 1990 with the Peace of Paris that truly ended the Cold War and started the era of globalization. And the era of globalization has trade and international trade as one of its hallmark and foundation basis for how the globe would operate. And so places that had rapid growth in population and employment, large spatial pattern distribution caused primarily, I'm going to say, by ports and airports and international centers around which the population organized themselves, and furthermore had logistics systems that really did introduce the supply chain of the global world. That really pushed a pattern of growth and development into very large regions. And what we found in our work with Sir Peter Hall was that it's occurring in Europe. Europe has about 6 to 8 of these large regions. We also identified with the studio class that there's around 9 to 10 of these regions emerging in the United States. These regions, when you look over the next 50 years, as Tridib mentioned, will have somewhere between 70 to 80% of all of the population growth in the United States. and comparably all of the employment in the United States, and furthermore about 85% of all the increased GMP. It is where this country is growing, and about 2/3 of the country is actually either stable in population or losing in population in these 9 or 10 large regions. And I'm going to leave the 9 or 10 alone and just say there are 10. But these large economic regions basically are finding that they truly can't plan, manage, or cope with what is affecting them. And in my relationships or discussions with my colleagues across the country, we all identified, from the large regions, I don't care whether it's from Chicago, from New York, Miami, Puget Sound, all of these regions are finding it difficult to cope with what is facing them. And then you put on top of all of that the fact that we're also in another global phenomenon, climate change and adaptation, and what you basically are finding in the field of growth, development, planning, public administration, and financing, that we're really entering a new world. And it's a world that we're not really prepared analytically, institutionally, or from the point of view of projects or programs. We're really not prepared for this particular area. And that's why having Dan create this as a focus and the university actually putting attention to it is an important step forward. These are the large regions. I'm not going to describe them all, except to say that the yellow area is the one that we're in. It basically extends from Las Vegas. Some are now arguing that the blue area, and I've continually argued that the blue to its right really is part of our mega region, the Tucson-Phoenix area. And Phoenix, Tucson, Las Vegas, and Southern California have a number of key economic bases in common. Entertainment, I don't care whether it's Disneyland here or Vegas. It's a place for a large number of retirees, Phoenix, Tucson, and finally, both Las Vegas and Phoenix and Los Angeles all basically build their economies off of what's coming out of our ports and airports. It's all part of a large logistics supply chain that's evolving in these regions, which brings us really to the subject of today's conversation, and that is, what are the challenges? How do these regions form an economic competitiveness unit within the globe? Let me just say that in China, I've been to forums in which not the president per se of the country, but the people that are leading its main departments get up and say, we're going to deal with climate change and we're going to deal with economic competitiveness through our mega regions. And they have 3 large regions in China, and they're following the same strategy there. About 80% of the GMP in China comes out of those 3 regions, and the rest of the GMP comes out of the others. They're the Yangtze Valley, the Pearl River, and the Jingling area around Beijing. Very large regions, but our competitors are organizing themselves along these lines, and in a much more formal way than we are. In Europe, the EU has not only planning, but they have resource allocation, and they have spatial planning strategies and economic recovery strategies that are geared explicitly towards these large regions. So the whole notion of how we compete will be important. And then the question that we were looking at in 2050, and that is not just mega regions, but what's the investment strategy for the United States in our 3rd century? In our 1st century, it was agriculture, and we had a president that led that. In our 2nd century, it was industrial, and we had another president. The first one was Jefferson. The second one was Teddy Roosevelt, that really built a century-long strategy that propelled growth in the United States. America 2050 is really aimed at what's our strategy for this century. And the strategy has a couple of key components. This is just a history of the portrayal of the history, but the strategy has a couple of key elements. The first one is high-speed rail. how do you pull together the large agglomerations or metropolitan areas within these large regions? And as Petra will point out, the high-speed rail is at the core of making a service economy more productive. The second is the notion of how does the United States participate globally in the movement of goods and in the supply chain. And the whole notion of goods movement and goods movement infrastructure is the second building block of these large regions. The third and fourth are essentially energy and resource issues. We're finding that the large economic regions, interestingly enough, have almost one-to-one mapping on the large ecological regions in the United States. The Great Lakes in that region, the Everglades, Florida, the Northwest Puget Sound. In the Bay Area, you have San Francisco Bay, the Delta, and the two rivers that flow into them. Southern California, you have an interesting phenomenon of all of the areas that I mentioned are really linked together in a survival issue of water and how do we deal with water. And then finally, all of the areas have an air quality climate overlay to them. And if you have that much economic activity in a concentrated area, your best strategies for dealing with global warming are basically going to become mega-region strategies on how the large region puts itself together so it consumes less energy and discharges less environmental degradation, or CO2. This just points out a couple of the issues. There are two basic policy instruments that 2050 developed. They're called a transnational or Trans-America network. The first is for passengers, and that's what Petra will be speaking to, namely high-speed rail, and the second is freight and goods movement. And that will be left for further talks, but the most important part of getting the notion of mega-regions identified as a policy instrument is to get basic national leadership and basic investment. And to that end, I won't say we're the cause of it, but we've been helpful to the president. When he first came into office, he said, I'm going to launch a high-speed rail initiative. America 2050 convened groups and a forum. Petra led that particular effort, came up with a report. That report went to the head of the transition team. The transition team and the head of it worked with the president, and out of all of that came the first national allocation of dollars to this system. And Petra has been working since that time to improve and approve upon the initial concept and to develop guidance for how we implement it.
Thank you, Mark, for those opening comments. My thesis today is that high-speed rail is what activates the latent economic potential of megaregions working together as one unit. So all the benefits that Mark alluded to that can be captured by megaregions, acting as sort of the new global units in the global economy, is only possible if you have those high-speed connections between the major population centers that comprise the megaregion. Otherwise, the negative impacts of congestion, the sort of negative externalities of concentrating all this growth and employment in these massive regions overwhelms the megaregions, and they cease to become effective places to live or do business, or they also have trouble sustaining their quality of life and water supply and air quality and so forth. So the idea here is that with high-speed rail, with these effective, fast transportation connections between the major centers of population and employment, and a corresponding land use strategy that orients development around station hubs, both at the inner city and the regional and local transit network level, then megaregions really do capture that economic potential that is inherent in them. But first, I must point out that high-speed rail is only appropriate for a limited number of places around the country. And those places tend to be the megaregions. We've actually identified 11 megaregions around the country. These are they. And high-speed rail primarily works to link the central business districts of large cities in large metropolitan areas to central business districts of other large cities or medium-sized cities connected to transit at distances in which it's too far to drive or too inconvenient to drive and probably too short to justify flying. Although in many places in the United States we do make those air trips at distances of 200 to 300 miles. So these are places in general, the places where just off the top of my head I can tell you high-speed rail is going to work are places like the dense Northeast corridor from Boston to Washington, D.C., California, certain corridors in the Midwest, perhaps Texas, Florida, the Southeast, and then your list, you sort of run out of places after that. That's not to say that passenger rail can't work in a lot of places around the country. I think incremental improvements to conventional intercity passenger rail is appropriate in many places around the country. But to make the very large investments in new high-speed rail systems with dedicated, separated, grade-separated right-of-ways really requires a substantial concentration of employment and population to generate the ridership for these new major infrastructure investments. Now, just to clarify, when I'm talking about high-speed rail for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to use the definition that the FRA provides of high-speed rail express. So that's the green line that you see down the center of this graph. They're saying high-speed rail express is 100 to 600 miles in length. It's grade separated. You're only sharing right-of-ways when you're coming into a center city. And you're reaching top speeds of about 150 miles per hour. That comports with the European Union's directives on high-speed rail. They define high-speed rail as speeds of about 250 kilometers per hour, which is 150 miles per hour on new systems, and 200 kilometers per hour, or which is 125 miles per hour on existing systems that are upgraded. Then the FRA has generous definitions. They also include a definition for high-speed regional, which basically describes what we have in the Northeast Corridor, the Amtrak Acela Express service, which provides a 2-hour, 45-minute trip between Washington, D.C. and New York City. And then emerging high-speed rail, which is sort of everything else that wants to be high-speed rail in the country, but isn't really. But for this presentation, I'm just talking about the high-speed rail express definition, and the only corridors currently being developed in the United States that meet that definition are here in California and in Florida. So before I get into the economic benefits of high-speed rail, I want to delve a little deeper into where are the places where high-speed rail works best, and what are the criteria and factors contributing to demand for ridership. America 2050 released a report last September, which you can download from our website, called Where High-Speed Rail Works Best. And this was sort of a quick and dirty analysis of 27,000 possible city pairs in the country. So basically we looked at all corridors between 100 and 500 miles in length, and we drew a straight line in between them. And then we evaluated them against a set of criteria. And those criteria were population in the two cities, the distance of the corridor, so it had to be in that 100 to 500 mile threshold, transit connections, the existence of rail transit and the extent of the rail transit system in those cities, economic productivity, which we measured as per capita regional GDP, congestion, looking at both aviation and auto congestion, and whether the corridor was in a megaregion. It got an extra point for that because that implied that it was grouped in regions that had multiple cities and connections. And from this study, we created an index of the top 100 city pairs in the country, which we thought were most suited for high-speed rail, which also allowed us to create this suggested phasing plan. Phase 1 is red, phase 2 is orange, phase 3 is yellow. And as you can see, we recommended that the federal government invest first in corridors in the Northeast, in California, and select corridors in the Midwest. And that matched somewhat some of the decisions that the FRA made, but not absolutely. We weren't with them all the way. So just to go into this a little bit more, metro area size population, that was one of the things we looked at. There's about 20 metros in the country that are over 2.5 million in population. But metro area boundaries vary across the country, so we wanted to get an even more fine-grained look at population density. So using GIS, we looked at the 10-mile buffers or radiuses around the stations in all the major cities in the country. And these are the top 40 population centers in the United States. And the center point is either the existing intercity rail station or the proposed intercity rail station if there's a high-speed rail proposal. Or if there's no station, it's just the center point of the downtown. So as you can see, New York, LA, at the top of the list. I highlighted in green the other California cities. If you are building a high-speed rail corridor in the United States, it better connect to one of these cities on this list. Otherwise, I think the chances are very slim that you would be able to generate enough ridership for those services. Then, not only is it important to look at population, you've got to look at employment too. So this is two charts looking at a 2-mile buffer around that station area, and you see the population density, residential population, and then employment density, which is a little bit different. Obviously, in this list you have LA fall to, I guess that's 9th on the list, and that's because not all of Los Angeles' employment is centered around Union Station in downtown. It's spread out over the region. But here the cities in red are cities that show up on both the lists, and again green is California. So it's just another aspect to think about it when you're thinking about how are we going to draw millions of people per year to pay the ticket fares and generate the ridership for this new service. Well, it helps if you already have a huge catchment area within 2 miles of the station or 5 miles of the station. If they're not already within walking distance or a short cab or car ride, you've got to be connecting them through local and regional transit networks. Or you got to be building really big parking lots around these stations, which you probably don't want to be doing. Distance, this schematic diagram I think is just useful in thinking about the fact that in our current national transportation system there's an efficiency gap in which we're probably overusing automobiles for long trips and overusing aviation for short trips. And there's a sort of sweet spot where high-speed rail works very efficiently, and that's somewhere in the trip distance of 100 to 500 or 600 miles. That's where rail works really well, and you can capture riders from auto and aviation modes. So going back to the transit networks, we just took an aerial view of different metropolitan regions, and these are all presented on the same scale here. And you can just see at a glance at the differences between these regions and the ability to capture either relatively few or tens of millions of passengers through varying developed rail networks. New York Metro has an enormous rail network. It has the highest ridership in the country, and it can draw from a region of 21 million people. Many of those people can get to Penn Station in Midtown Manhattan using a rail connection, so they don't need to drive into the center city. Not to make Houston feel bad, but you compare that to Houston, which is a region of almost 6 million people, and they have a tiny little light rail in the downtown. So that's not going to help them very much if they build a high-speed rail station in downtown. They're going to have to figure out how their passengers are going to get to that station. And then this is just taking a closer look at Los Angeles. Annual rail volumes, about 92 million a year. We estimated that about 14% of the residential population has access to transit within a 25-mile radius of downtown. And 30% of employment is situated with access to rail transit within a 25-mile radius of LA. And again, I'm picking on Houston today. I hope no one's from there, but compared to Houston, about 1.4% of their population is within a half-mile walking distance of rail transit within a 25-mile radius of downtown. And I'm not going to show you the New York numbers because that would just make you feel bad. Then it's also important to think about the structure of economies. And in our first study, we looked at economic productivity as sort of a proxy for robust economies and places that will tend to generate more ridership for high-speed rail. Moving forward, we're going to look at what share of employment in each region is concentrated in service sectors, and particularly knowledge sectors, because the research shows that that's generally the people who use high-speed rail for business travel. You don't necessarily have factory workers traveling from city to city on high-speed rail, but you do have people in law and media and communications and public policy and government and those sectors. Did you know that the USDA has a data set for creative class industries on their website that you can download by county? I thought that was kind of interesting. And then really the primary indicator, I think, of demand, potential ridership demand for intercity services are the existing aviation markets today in the United States. And California has the largest short-haul air market in the United States, so that's a very good indicator for ridership demand for a California high-speed rail service. Other big markets in the Northeast, in Texas, and across Europe, we've seen that when they've implemented a new high-speed rail service connecting two cities, after the service is implemented, they grab a big share of the previous air market comes to rail. So that happened when they built the Paris to Lyon connection. This graph shows the AVE service between Madrid and Barcelona, which was built in the last 5 years or so. They currently have captured 48% of the air rail market is in the high-speed service, and they expect that that number will grow as people get more accustomed to using the service. I should mention that in the Northeast Corridor today, where we don't even have what I'm calling high-speed rail service for the purposes of this talk, the Acela, or the rail, both the Northeast Regional Rail and the Acela service in the Northeast captures 65% of the air rail market between New York City and Washington, D.C. today. It captures much less in the New York to Boston market because that trip is longer and less competitive with air. And then just again to show you the air volumes in California, the chart shows you looking at all air markets under 600 miles in the country. The flights within California or connecting to California capture half of the top 10 flights in the United States. So California really does have a lot of the air market in the United States, and I think that bodes well for ridership demand in California. And you see the relative size of the air markets are shown by the width of the gray lines there. So now shifting gears, I want to take you through some of the arguments and evidence for high-speed rail's impact on regional economic development. Putting aside for the moment direct jobs created by high-speed rail construction, engineering, planning, consultants, train operators, people that will work on the rail, and the prospect for new manufacturing jobs of creating new rail cars and so forth. This is really strictly looking at what are the potential for regional economic development resulting from new high-speed rail connections. And most of the observations I'm going to make in the next few slides are drawn from some of the research that's being done currently for the HS2 proposal in the United Kingdom. About 2-3 weeks ago, the British government proposed a new high-speed rail service between London and Birmingham, and a major project, and they're very focused on evidence-based arguments in the UK. So there's a whole wealth of new reports looking at cost-benefit analysis and the economic regeneration impacts of high-speed rail investment. So I've been brushing up on that literature. I was with some of my colleagues in London a couple weeks ago and learned a lot about the experience in other European countries with high-speed rail. So I bring that to this presentation today. So the first concept here is that high-speed rail boosts productivity for service sector businesses. Basically, you're going to save time and save money by moving workers more efficiently between major employment centers, promoting more interactions between businesses, more face-to-face interactions, and this supports the growth of the knowledge sector, the creative class. You only exchange tacit knowledge in face-to-face interactions. And there's increasing support for the notion that face-to-face interaction is vital to the knowledge sector. So that's the first argument. And that increased productivity translates to basically higher wages and cost savings for businesses. The second and third concept is that with high-speed rail, you can deepen labor markets for employers. So you can expand the scope from which you can draw trained workers to your place of business, which is a plus for employers. And then on the flip side, for employees moving to a region, you broaden the employment pool for a worker, so you have more job options. And it may allow workers to live in cheaper housing further away from employment centers, which may or may not be a good thing from a land use and environmental perspective, depending on how they're getting there. But if they're getting there via high-speed rail, it opens more options for workers within a region. The fourth concept is that high-speed rail facilitates agglomeration economies, meaning industry sectors can become more specialized exporters of services or goods because of the relationships they will build with their suppliers or marketers or researchers or labor force that all concentrate in a similar geographic area. So high-speed rail can facilitate these agglomeration economies over a larger area because you can move people faster, more easily over larger distances. And the image attempts to illustrate that a bit. This is the Northeast megaregion, and some UPenn students mapped the sort of different sectors of the big pharma health industry in the Northeast. And as you can see, they're sort of scattered around the map on the Northeast corridor. Now, right now, we have a lot of traffic congestion in the Northeast. We also have very good rail service, but it could be improved. But if you made travel easier, faster, the idea is that these connections can be strengthened. People might pop over for a meeting in the afternoon more readily if they can get there quickly. And all of that boosts economic productivity exchange agglomeration. Point 5. Investment in intercity rail and the station area around it can serve as a focal point for future development. And I show a picture of Lille, France, which is sort of held up as a case study this is a city in northern France. It was a former manufacturing region that was not doing too well. They gave it a station on the Eurostar service between Paris and London. And then the city created a zoning and incentives to locate office buildings around this station, and it's really brought itself up. The overall regional GDP has improved, job growth has taken place. It got a lot of government incentives, so I have to leaven it with that. But this can be a tool for economic development if you make the right choices about land development. And then another notion is that high-speed rail can allow you to make better, more efficient use of infrastructure. So going back to that chart that showed the overuse of automobiles, the overuse of aviation, with high-speed rail, you can really steer people towards the most efficient mode for the length of their trip. And you may be able in certain regions to, say, avoid building another runway at LAX if you were to provide a high-speed connection to a smaller airport that could handle some of those passengers. And then finally, I wanted to just throw out that there are some transformative effects of high-speed rail that we may not yet even be able to comprehend. And I was reading a study by TRB, Transportation Research Board, of the economic effects of the interstate highway system. And they basically said the planners of the interstate system could never have contemplated the economic synergies and development that took place in the United States after the build-out of this national system. And the quotation talks about how it fundamentally altered relationships between time, cost, and space in a manner which allowed new economic opportunities to emerge that never would have emerged under previous technologies. So it may be that there are some economic impacts that alter economic geography in ways that at this point we can't really quantify in a cost-benefit analysis or even understand at this point in the planning process. Now, I want to include some cautions and some caveats about the economic benefits of high-speed rail. First, I would say beware of the notion of build it and they will come. High-speed rail is not an economic generator in and of itself. It can boost economic productivity, as I've shown. It can save costs for established established employment centers. But good luck if you want to just plop a high-speed rail station down in the middle of nowhere and expect a small city to arise around it and economic benefits to ensue. And there's a couple of clunkers that have been experienced. I show two in France. One is Haute-Picardie, a city in northern France as well, which locals call the beetroot station because it's surrounded by beet farmer fields, beet fields, and it has really underperformed in terms of ridership. They couldn't decide which city to put it in, so they put it in between two small cities. It doesn't have any transit connections, and it doesn't have much ridership as a result, and they've cut service to that station. The second one is Lille Saint-Exupéry station, which is actually an airport station, or it's near the airport. It has this beautiful Santiago Calatrava head house, but more people use the Lyon Center City station. So that's another one that's underperformed in terms of ridership. So you have to make sure that you have a strategy, a land use strategy, an economic strategy that accompanies this big investment in a high-speed rail station. Then finally, or not finally, there's some evidence that when you're connecting a large city like Los Angeles with a smaller city, a suburban city or medium-sized city, there's mixed evidence on where the economic benefits are accrued. If there's a smart strategy for the smaller city, that city may be able to capture the benefits of connecting to LA. But in some cases, if it's just a park and ride facility, for example, it's more likely that the benefits will be accrued by Los Angeles because people will just use the park and ride facility to get to LA, and few people will come from LA to the smaller city to come to a park and ride facility. So again, you have to have your strategy well thought out on this. And then I also wanted to cite a new study by Chia-Lin Chen and Peter Hall at University College London, in which they've done a longitudinal study of rail services in the UK. They have 125 mile per hour rail services in the UK, which is just conventional rail, but those were instituted starting in the 1970s, and they looked back at many of cities that were connected by the rail services and cities that were not connected to London by the rail services, compared them doing a regression analysis, and found overall cities that became within a 2-hour commuting distance to London as a result of the shrinking geography of a new high-speed service benefited in terms of gross value added, which is their measure of GDP. So it was a mixed bag. It was not always that case, but the majority of the cities they looked at did benefit when they were put within a 2-hour commuting distance of London. So I'm nearing the end, and I just wanted to sort of bring this back up to the federal level, include our president and his statement of vision for this program. And this was actually a remark pertaining to the stimulus bill, but I think it's important to focus on the idea that high-speed rail is it's the foundation for long-term growth and prosperity in the country. It's not just about creating jobs in the short term through construction of big projects. This is really about laying the foundation for how our regions will grow and develop in the future. And I also thought you might find this interesting in California as you're going through a very long process of developing high-speed rail in California. One of the British researchers that we visited a few weeks ago said that large public support for large infrastructure projects that cost lots of money tend to go through multiple phases, starting from sort of low support, no idea, no justification, building support as people learn about it, pinnacle of support as people sort of push it over the edge, and you might consider this the bond measure in California for high-speed rail. Then a fall off as people realize, oh, this is going to come through my community, this will cost this much money. Then panic right before implementation, which maybe you're at right now, and then regaining support as the benefits emerge again. And to close, I just want to say that both at the state and the federal level, realizing these projects, completing these high-speed rail projects will require sustained commitment and leadership at the state and the federal level. It will require dedicated funding and strong support from the civic community and advocates. And I hope that we can provide that support for the projects that make sense, the places that have the population, the employment, the transit connections to really make these services work so that we can reap the benefits. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. And I just want to acknowledge some of my colleagues at RPA who worked on this presentation. Thank you.
So let me begin by saying that I'm interested in, this is all very exciting about this high-speed rail and its impact on the megaregion and the environment. I have a strong interest in urban form and the urban form and the land use issues. And I think, as Petra correctly pointed out, when you think about one of the advantages, if the high-speed rail actually captures this the sweet spot in the local kind of air traffic, there are some interesting possibilities in terms of the future growth of these regions. One, we all prefer compact growth. So typically, I think what we're going to expect, because the economics of this kind of regional growth, the stations. So if you imagine the difference between a station and an airport, airports are not very friendly for kind of a transit-oriented development, right? The airport take a lot of space. Although increasingly we're seeing, like in most of the major airports, there are a lot of businesses and hotels and restaurants and things like that are cropping up. It's become quite customary to businesses to have meetings near airport hotels. So you fly in, have your meeting in one of the hotels, and then you fly back out. Some of the universities are doing when they're searching for a dean or faculty, they actually send the whole search committee to meet some airport hotel near the airport. But it's not as compact situation, but the stations could be much more compact, and one could expect that these stations will serve as a more really like business nodes. So any future growth of businesses, the service sector growth that Petra pointed to, could happen around the stations, with the exception of some of the French anomalies. So there are those kinds of possibilities. On the other hand, however, I worry a little bit about the larger sort of environmental impacts resulting from this high-speed rail network growth and all that, although there will be some nodal growth, no doubt. But the growth will ultimately, residential growth and things like that, will spread across the landscape. So we need to sort of think about what that would mean to the larger region. And I wanted to show this slide, and I know Daike is here somewhere. You're right here. So I wanted to show you some images of the Ruhr from Germany. Ruhr, as you know, the industrial region in Germany, which actually is not quite a mega region, because the Ruhr, that rectangular area actually fits pretty much within the Los Angeles metropolitan region. So the Ruhr in 1840, the top picture shows it was, as to be expected. This is the pre-industrial landscape of northwestern Germany. In the 30s, when with the industrial revolution, industrial growth, Ruhr happened to have a lot of deposit of coal and iron ore, and it became the major kind of industrial belt. A lot of the steel factories and coal mines were all built. This is where Hitler's the war machines supply actually was produced there, because when the Allied forces started to bomb the heck out of most of the Ruhr regions. So these are kind of the growths that are happening. These gray areas are the coal mines and industrial areas. So these are the growth of these towns, like a galaxy of cities, going, things like Essen on the one hand, and Düsseldorf, and then Dortmund, and all of those sort of good places, Bochum. And they're sort of a self-supporting independent kind of a cities. But watch what happened by 1970. The 1970, it has become pretty much of a major urban sprawl, a mega sprawl one might call, and with a huge impact on the environment. So this is the Rhine River, this one going through, curling through, and this is the Emscher River. Emscher River, as you can see, all the industries, big collieries and coal plants and steel plants and all that, they're just dumping their waste, and it became a major catastrophe. So the lander of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the state of, and which is the strongest government agency, stepped in, and they started the IBA project, then led to a lot of not only sort of wonderful recycling of this industrial structure, which became obsolete, but also cleaning up the environment. And that led to a major kind of a regional system of open space, and as well as the transportation system. The wonderful thing about Ruhr, for example, in Germany, and most part of Germany, they have a kind of a seamless network of transportation, from light rail to regional rail to intercity rail to the the mega regional, the Eurostar Express and high-speed trains. But this is back in 2003 or 2001 when he dug into a little bit of research on what percentage of people are using transit. Turned out only 30% of the people are actually using transit. A large number of Germans of the Ruhr at the time were actually driving. And so despite the network and all of that, what is happening that the preference for a single family detached home, like an American suburb, was increasing, and essentially what was happening, the suburbanization of the Ruhr, so I don't have the 2000 picture, so it has become much more denser, and a lot of the open space systems that was set aside for open space, they're now filled by highways and extensions of roads and things like that. So the point I wanted to make is that the growth of the region, mega region, while there is a kind of neat, clean image when you think about high-speed rail and kind of a nodal growth and all that, but no doubt there will be kind of a secondary, tertiary impact of growth that will lead to urbanization, that will lead to sort of more larger urban sprawl. So one of the, I think, challenges in the mega region ultimately, my second and third point, is to deal with the environment and how to sort of control the environment, maintain the environment, and that's one big problem, and that leads to, let me see, I wanted to show you another slide here. This one here. We think in California we have a problem of governance, regional governance, right? But look at the California's local governments per 100,000 compared to the rest of the 49 states in the United States. And there are more cities per 100,000 people, more counties, more school districts, etc., special districts throughout the country. And so one of the, I think, major challenges of this kind of mega region planning, of course, will be the governance. And Dan Wezmanian is sitting here. This is the Banerjee Center for Governance. And so how to manage these issues of growth and land use and environmental control become a sort of parallel kinds of issues that we'll have to deal with as we look at the growth of the development of the high-speed rail. So let me just stop there.
I think Tridib put his finger on what I feel is the most significant issue in these large-scale regions, and that is how do you plan, manage, and finance them. And to that end, Dan has encouraged me to develop a course in that area. This summer, I will be teaching an intensive 599 on specifically the issue of how do you plan, how do you manage, and how do you finance large-scale regions. And in many many respects, I'm going to suggest that it's not only here in the United States, but it's also the same issue that is problematic in Europe. And the Chinese, and we had a session at Healdsburg where we invited our Chinese colleagues over, and you'll find this amusing. They said, gee, I'm here because I heard you had these council of governments, and we think that maybe you can help us figure out how we manage our highly decentralized system. So if we think China and India is even further off on that path, has the clue to manage these, they don't. I think it is the fundamental issue. I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity for that advertisement. And I think we now have, hopefully we have some time for questions, Tridib.
What lessons can be learned from Japan and Europe in terms of how regions with high-speed rail develop and what kind of support infrastructure is needed? So I know from the Shinkansen, the stations became hubs, the enormous feeders. Here when you look at rapid transit in LA, it's very difficult to use because for the most part, as you say, in some stations you just get off and there's nothing else there and there's your car. And so they don't necessarily contribute to a lot of economic growth as a result.
Well, I'll probably build on comments I've made previously. I think that Japan has an advantage in that it's a very narrow, or it's an island in which there's a narrow stretch which can be developed, so it has an incredible amount of density, and so I think that really just naturally predetermined it for the levels of density that are needed to support high-speed rail. But I'm still doing the research on the case studies around Europe, but the real early highlight is that stations that are not connected by transit don't generate the same ridership that stations that are in city centers and connected by transit do. So I think that will be a particular challenge in this region because you don't have high transit ridership. You still have, overall auto use and dependency. So how do you make a station in this region accessible to the large metro population and make it work? And perhaps Mark has thoughts on that. But I think that's the key, the early takeaway is that it makes sense to locate these stations in city centers and connect them to transit.
With respect to this region, the regional plan for Southern California has both a growth and spatial plan and a transit high-speed rail plan in it, and we have been developing that over the past 30 years. And that culminated in what Tridib mentioned, and that is the growth vision. And interestingly enough, the marketplace is going to drive the development pattern, and the marketplace is going to, in fact, be the cornerstone to driving the investments that will be supported in this region. And it's all driven, to get an understanding of this, just go listen to Dow Myers for one of his sessions, and you'll totally understand why in the next 20 to 30 years, 85% of all the housing built will be non-traditional supported, non-traditional, not dispersed housing, but concentrated housing and development. So I think the marketplace is going to really be the underpinning for this region. And that's a whole subject of another session, but I think we had another question over here.
Probably mainly a comment. Yeah, Dyke Peters, I'm a European transplant here at USC, and I actually direct a multi-year research project out of the Technical University in Berlin on urban redevelopment around major rail stations, currently looking sort of all across Europe. So
great, I'd love to.
Well, we need to capture her.
Yeah. So I have a lot of comments and thoughts, but we'll do lunch, so we'll talk more. I want to make two main comments, and I guess one of them on the mega regions and one on the high-speed rail. And I think it was really, really helpful that to put that picture of my own home region, the Ruhr Valley, up there in terms of the mega regions, because I think it kind of really brought home the fact that mega regions is obviously just a black box. It can mean so many different things, and if you wanted to connect that to a discourse on rail, you immediately have to look at what's inside that region and obviously how any sort of high-speed system would connect to conventional and other opportunities, and whether or not there is a rail-based transit system or not. And I think that is really sort of the meat of the story, and where a lot of the big discourse really breaks down into a lot of very, very different individual case studies. So that's, you know,
Right.
and you've obviously just scratched the surface, and I think so much of what you've talked about today is stimulating and interesting, and working more on that Europe to US comparison is definitely very fruitful. But yeah, I mean, there is that main difference in Europe where you have, you know, entirely different system of multi-level governance, and obviously the EU has a very different animal than the federal government over here, and just decades and decades long investment specifically into regions and sort of the whole restructuring governance system, and really, you know, national infrastructure plans in addition to EU level funding. So I think the whole story of even high-speed rail development and regional economic development in Europe has so much to do with that, and there's simply no equivalent, and you know that. The other thing, I think everything that you said about high-speed rail and sort of the rationales for investing into it, I think you said all the right things, and I just think at the end of the day, I think the argument becomes muddled if you keep trying to make an argument for high-speed rail sort of on the basis of somehow it's going to help alleviate metropolitan congestion or immediately do something for that. Because I think really if also you look at Europe, starting the rationale at the very top and saying it really sort of it should be a national infrastructure issue, and you know, it's something that is connecting regions. Mm-hmm. You know, it's an intercity service at the end of the day. It's going to connect, you know, major metropolitan areas and their cores, and I think that really should be the focus of the argument. What that's going to do for either of these two places, and being honest about how the place is going to be left in the middle also. So it's, you know, very often going to be a strengthening of existing cores at the expense of other regions. And I think that, you know, and so I think really when you brought home those pictures on how really this is a substitute for short haul air travel, that really is the meat of the argument, and for environmental reasons and others. And I think not to take away from that, I think that's very, very important. And that also sort of changes the argument, the specifics of the basis for investment looking at the US. Because obviously the Northeast corridor is a very, very different story with having existing rail. The one other last comment I'll make, I could keep going, I think is you know, in Europe,
She likes our subject,
London,
Petra.
Paris, I mean, you talk about the two megacities in Europe pre-existing that really are absolute primate cities in their respective countries. And sort of the French rationale for investing in high-speed rail and pouring billions into it has a lot to do with sort of, you know, Paris, the center of, like the spider, the center of this, you know, and investing and never really questioning it, sort of a regular, you know, private sector cost-benefit analysis. Yeah. And I think that starting the argument from that angle makes a lot more sense than trying to somehow talk about congestion alleviation. Any transportation planner is going to just blast that right off.
Those are great comments, and I was careful not to say that this would provide congestion relief, because I think that I don't necessarily think it will provide congestion relief, even for airports, because if you eliminate those short haul flights from an airport, they'll just be filled up with, it'll provide more space for long haul national and international flights, which is good for the economic growth of the region. So it'll just shift, when those slots open up, they'll be taken right away, just as when you build more lane capacity on a highway, it fills right up with cars. Just one thing I wanted to point out is I think that it goes back to your comment earlier in terms of lessons from Europe, that classic political dilemma of, you know, which cities get a station. Every small city wants a station, but if you stop at every small city, you don't have high-speed rail. And I heard some discussion when I was in London of the process of building the Eurostar, and there was a point at which they said there were a number of cities in contention for stops in southern England, and they basically said, well, come to us and give us your proposals about, you know, what is your economic strategy, what will you do for the station area, you know, let's see what you're going to put on the table in terms of linking this into a broader regional growth strategy, and then we'll decide who gets the station. So I think, you know, learning how to navigate that very tricky political process and addressing that head on is going to be key to making the California system work. And we were in discussions yesterday with some of the local stakeholders here about those battles already playing out. So I think that's going to be very important to address.
Just one other observation on your notion that this is not a congestion relief strategy. Basically, if these large economic regions and global gateways is going to be, and we're going to live in a global century, then the attractiveness of these large economic regions to bring population and employment to them is going to be the issue that we're going to have to sort out and have the infrastructure to allow them to survive. And the high-speed rail, I think, is one component of that strategy. An equal and I think a more impactful infrastructure investment on why these large regions are developing are the supply chains that need space and create a lot of economic activity. And building the panoply of infrastructure, and which is really part of a larger strategy, is absolutely critical if the United States over the next 30 or 40 or 50 years is going to be competitive in a global environment. So this is not, I mean, the Trans-America systems are what does America need to invest in this century if we are in fact going to keep up with people who are building these systems. Because Europe and China, Japan, et cetera, they're all building at this scale. Not only the high speed, but the infrastructure. Frank, I see that you finally...
I'd like to just offer a couple things. So good to see you, Tridib. We have a long history together, and thank you, Mark, for mentioning my past in high-speed rail. I have three comments. Number one, we started here talking about CBD to CBD and the existing cities and the existing concentrations and so on. There was this mention of what occurred with the interstate system. While I understand you can't just run a high-speed rail out here and end it and there's going to be a new city, I think that along the high-speed rail routes, as they get longer and more interconnected, we can see a new frontier opening in America. There's, God knows, plenty of land. We use about 2 or 3% of it for urbanization. And there may indeed be some major ecologic advantages in that, particularly in relationship to food production and so on. So I don't think we should miss the possibilities of another opening of a frontier in America and new settlement patterns in addition to those things concentrating in the existing cities. And that takes a lot more going into, but I just wanted to mention that. Another thing I wanted to mention was the change of government. You've touched on it, but what's going to happen here with these mega regions? What's going to happen to states? What's going to happen to our existing...
Are you betting?
Huh?
Are you sort of baiting me, Frank?
Well, I mean...
Apparently.
There's, and what's going to happen even long range to nations. The Cities in the Wealth of Nations by Jane Jacobs really goes into the possibility of mega regions functioning as nations in their trade policies, in their monetary policies, and so on. What's going to happen with nations, what's going to happen with states as this evolves, I think it's worth giving some thought to. One other thing is, it relates to the first one actually, I forgot to mention. The number of smaller cities and medium-sized cities occurring today in China is staggering. So it is not just those three regions you mentioned, Beijing and Shanghai and Dali Pearl. There are thousands of them. And I think it merits looking at that again to see how the mega region and how the high-speed rail infrastructure might stimulate a different kind of urbanization in areas that now have little, if any, urbanization. So good luck.
Just a couple of quick points. In China, there are literally the institutional measles that Tridib painted. They're more intense in their regions. Their regions are very large. The Yangtze River Valley is about 130 million people. The Shanghai, the Pearl River is about 70 million, and the Jingling is about 30 or 40, with thousands of small cities. And the problem that they face is how do they pull all, and by the way, Deng Xiaoping decentralized China probably as much as, if not more than the United States. So they're facing this institutional issue of how do we pull this constellation together. And on your other point with respect to institutions, we will not recognize, I think we're going to have nations, we're going to have states, and we're going to have municipalities, but we're probably not going to recognize the roles that they will play. And the question then becomes, institutionally, how do you put them together? And that is really at the heart of the course that I will be developing, and that is, what did I learn from Southern California, a highly decentralized place? How do you pull it together and how do you pull it together so that it has a chance of operating in a coherent way? I'm not saying that it will, but so that it has a chance. And I think that is the institutional design issue, is the fundamental challenge of this century, not the technical, not the infrastructure, and not the financing issues, but how do we pull ourselves together so we can survive in conjunction with our environment.
My focus is in transportation, and because of that, I kind of enjoy high-speed rail. One of the things they always talk about is being sold as a climate change, as a way to deal with climate change. From a life cycle perspective, have you all heard of anything about how long this would actually have to run to be carbon neutral? Because when you think about all the concrete they're going to be pouring to build this grade separation, if it's 40 years to just be zero, is it worth doing from an environmental perspective?
That's a very smart question, and I haven't seen the studies, but it's certainly come up recently. And I'll just point out for everyone else, the high-speed rail carbon advantage is if your tracks are electrified and if you're drawing from renewable sources. So not only do you need to build high-speed rail, you got to make sure your state has the energy production that's in renewables and not in coal-fired power plants. But yeah, the life cycle costs are big. This is a major infrastructure project akin to building a new airport or a major new highway or something like that. And I don't know the answer to your question, but it's a very important one.
Well, any savings in aviation would be a big saving. That's one of the most intensive.
What the British studied, and they did it because the French were promoting this, they found, as Petra pointed out, if you use nuclear, as they do in France, it's fine. But if a train is going at faster than 150 miles an hour, the coefficient of drag and the amount of energy that you need to get over that coefficient, unless it's in a vacuum tube, it's actually it's a carbon negative strategy. And that needs to be factored into how, in fact, we design this, how fast they go, as well as the materials needed to build them. So it's not a clear-cut case that you go to high-speed rail and therefore, over airplanes, you therefore reduce your carbon footprint. You can if you design it correctly or if you plan it correctly. But the relationship to climate and how we do the carbon footprint analysis is really a very critical component of the design of these systems, of this system, and it's also true in the freight movement.
Maybe one quick.
I was just wondering if you keep mentioning France and England, but have you looked at any Spanish studies? Because Spain is, I think, on the verge of becoming have the most track length in the world, and prior to high-speed rail, I know the Spanish had, the culture was kind of a hesitancy to leave their region. They were largely auto-dependent and error-dependent, and I was looking at statistics comparing to California, and they have, I was wondering if we could model some of their forecasting in terms of, we have similar populations and actually very similar GDP. So in terms of connecting the cities, whether we can model some of those studies and what they're doing. Specifically California, I mean.
That's interesting. I don't know if the comparison would work out. You should explore that. One thing I have observed in looking at the Spanish case is that they've moved forward with that strategy and committed to high-speed rail without doing the cost-benefit analysis. They've really decided that this is key. This is a national policy to connect their country and bring regions together and promote mobility. And they haven't evaluated it with a balance sheet. They've said, we think this is a good thing. We're going to connect cities. We're going to make it possible for residents to travel the country, and we're going to make the fares fairly cheap as well so that people can afford to ride it. So they've made a commitment. It's a core of their national strategy, and they're going to do it. And they have, they've built 2 lines already. So that's different compared to the UK, which is right now building a case for this new line and trying to justify it on cost benefit and all those things.
And we've done, the same group that went to England has also gone to Spain on a couple of occasions to look at mega-region strategies. And the one question that came out of all of those discussions, and that is they had a large euro contribution to infrastructure that is now run out, and furthermore, they now have to pay the piper, and they're having a very difficult time paying the piper. And these cost, revenue, benefit issues increasingly are going to become important, not only for Spain, but also for the United States. How we grow this system, given the huge cost and the need for revenues, and how we put our institutions together so we can make these projects pencil out as business plans, is probably, next to institutional, the next difficult issue they're going to face.
Though it's important to note that you can't always account for all the benefits of high-speed rail with a traditional cost-benefit analysis.
Please,
Thanks, everyone.
to our speakers.